Hey fellow hop killers, it's Dylan with the Hop Killer Brewery, where we bring the brews, reviews, and how-tos. And in this video, we're going to do a grain to glass of a West Coast IPA using 100% Admiral Malting's Admiral Pils. Before I break down the recipe and get into the specifics of fermentation and overall impressions with this West Coast IPA, I want to give a shout out to the sponsor of today's video, Into the AM. Into the AM is a men's apparel company that produces high quality clothing from everything from graphic tees to blank tees and so much more. If you're interested in checking out any of their clothing, I will have their website linked down in the description below. And if you want 10% off your order, make sure to use code HOPKILLER, all one word. I've been wearing clothing from Into the AM for years now, well before they sponsored today's video. I can vouch for how long lasting and high quality their t-shirts are. I have a few t-shirts that are 2 or 3 years old at this point, and I still rock them today. I feel like they have a very nice fitting cut to them. Again, feel free to check them out. Website down in the description below. 10% off your order if you use code HOPKILLER. Thanks again, Into the AM. Now, let's break into the recipe for this killer West Coast IPA that uses lager yeast and 100% Admiral Malting's Admiral Pils. The full recipe will be down in the description below as well. Make sure to check it out. So let's get into it. West Coast IPA, 4-gallon US batch size and a 90-minute boil. 6 gallons of RO water. I treated it with 6 milliliters of lactic acid and 3.5 grams of gypsum, 2.5 grams of calcium chloride, and 2 grams of Epsom salt, all of which was mixed into the water before I mashed in. When it comes to the mash, the only malt used was 100% Admiral Pils by Admiral Maltings out in Alameda, California. If you haven't already, make sure you check out the previous videos I've done, not only of their facility, a whole behind the scenes tour from literally where they intake the grain and the entire malting process to where they bag it up. There's also a video that goes into the malting process more in detail and kind of more about Admiral Maltings from Tim, who is their lead maltster and social media manager over at Admiral Maltings. One more video to come, but this is kind of a result of the collaboration with Admiral Maltings, making a beer with 100% Admiral Pils. What's crazy is that I've visited the field in which this grain was grown 30 miles from my house. It's also malted 60 miles from my house, and to be brewing a beer with it that was basically grown in my backyard, pretty mind-blowing. But I digress. Like I said, it was a 90-minute boil. We hit it with half an ounce of Simcoe at 90 minutes for a total contribution, 31 IBU. No other hop additions were added until 10 minutes left into the boil, where I added 1 whirfloc tablet and 0.25 ounces or quarter of an ounce of Simcoe for a 5 IBU contribution. I then added 2 more milliliters of lactic acid to drive down the pH. After the boil, it was chilled down to 170 degrees for a 20-minute whirlpool, where I then added 1 ounce of Simcoe and 1 ounce of Strata, both of which basically 4 IBU contribution. And the total IBU for this beer calculated was 45. Once the whirlpool was done, I finished chilling the beer. We then added 2 packets of 3470 by Fermentis, their lager yeast. And so we're going to get into that in a second, but let me finish out the recipe for you guys. I then dry hopped with 3 ounces of Simcoe and 3 ounces of Strata 7 days into primary fermentation. The recipe will be down in the description below. Let's talk about fermentation, and let's talk about the fact that I use a lager yeast to ferment what I'm still calling a West Coast IPA. I'm not calling it a cold IPA. It's not any other variation of IPA. It's not an IPL, nothing. I'll talk about a cold IPA and all that in another video if you would prefer. Make sure you let me know down in the comments below. But in my opinion, even though this IPA was fermented with a lager yeast, which we're going to get into the temperature in a second, I still don't think it's a cold IPA necessarily. After the boil, we had a starting gravity of 1057 and a final gravity of 1008, giving this a total 6.5% ABV. I said I used the lager yeast for this IPA. Why did you use lager yeast, Dylan? Well, that's a really great question. I have been seeing a ton more IPAs coming out with lager yeast, whether they're cold IPAs, this or that IPA. Nonetheless, people have been rocking lager yeast for IPAs for years, I'm sure. I don't know who, but I've heard tons of podcasts where there's brewers using lager yeast, not calling it anything other than an IPA, and consumers don't even realize. Cold IPA is really hot right now in 2023, but to me, cold IPA has a 30 to 40% flaked rice or corn. This beer in particular, I wanted to try it out. I've actually never used 3470 before, and I figured, well, what the hell? Let's do it. I wanted to have that crispness, that easy finishing beer that comes with lager yeast, and I wanted the hoppiness and all the goodness that comes with West Coast IPA all in one beer. So I pitched 2 packets of 3470. It started ripping almost, within 12 hours, maybe 16 hours or so, but it was roaring, and the temperature was set at 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So chilled it down to 60, pitched the 2 packets after oxygenating, even though I don't know if I'm supposed to. You guys can correct me down in the comments. And so for, day 1 to day 3, fermentation was ripping. On day 3, I set the fermenter for 64 degrees Fahrenheit to kind of let it go as it started to tail off. Day 5, fermentation was slowing down. I measured the gravity, took a gravity reading and a pH reading. Gravity was the same as I finished at, so it was 1008, so 1008. And the pH at the moment of checking it on day 5 was 4.42. This was before dry hopping. Day 7, I checked it again just to make sure, and again, 1008. So I added the dry hops at 64 degrees Fahrenheit. I let them sit in there for 2 days, and on day 9, I set the temperature for 36 degrees Fahrenheit. On day 10, 24 hours later, I transferred from the fermenter into a serving keg, and I roughly got about 3-ish gallons out of this 4-gallon batch. So that is the recipe, the fermentation schedule that I followed with this beer. And let me get a sip before we finish talking about this beer. So good. Okay, let's talk aroma. So this was 50-50 Strata and Simcoe, essentially from the whirlpool on. In terms of West Coast, this hits all the markers. This is what I would classify as like a new school West Coast IPA. And what do you mean by new school, Dylan? Because just because you use lager yeast doesn't mean it's new school. I understand that. And what I mean by new school is like more of that juicy, less bitter, very lean West Coast IPA. And by lean, I mean like the malt doesn't really stand in the way. This is 100% Pilsner malt. And granted, it's by Admiral Pills. a little more flavorful than probably your traditional, but nonetheless, it's 100% Pilsner malt. It's really light in body, or really light in color. It's a light body, and you know, it's mostly out of the way, and the hops are doing all the work. There's no caramel malts, there's no dextrin malts, nothing. In terms of aroma, I get like green melon, kind of like a subtle dankiness to it, like not cannabis, like not super strong, not super dank, but it's there, like a little resiny quality, and maybe like a subtle citrus note to it as well. And flavor, let's break into the flavor. I get grapefruit, like almost like sweet grapefruit, the actual fruit, not the rind, not the pith. I get like from the malt does have some character into this, and it's subtle and it's complementary. It's there, but it's not. It's, supportive, but it tends to vanish when the hops take over. And I get like kind of the like a very light note of very light breadiness quality that you probably would typically get with a Pilsner malt. Maybe like a sweeter bread. It's like a very subtle light bread quality that comes from the malt that I feel is very complementary to the beer personally. And it's not all hops. You have this tiny smidge note of, malt to it in the most pleasant way. I get like underripe apricot and kind of this like piney, resiny quality. In terms of the mouthfeel, it's light in body. It's really crisp and refreshing, as our boy Party Rob knows. One of the most crisp and refreshing West Coast IPAs to date, for sure. Bitterness, very subtle bitterness, kind of like in the middle of the palate, and then it finishes, and it lingers in flavor, but like all the perfect juicy flavors are just hanging out. Now that we've talked about aroma, we've talked about mouthfeel, we've talked about taste and appearance. This was no biofine. This was just transferred. This is just time, and it does have a little bit of a chill haze. If I were to biofine it or use gelatin, I think this would drop ultra clear, and I definitely will do that next time, because I'm the type of person that definitely likes clear beer when it's meant to be clear. There's just something about bright beer that just is beautiful, and beer is not only taste, it's about aroma, it's about, visually what it looks like, and if this was ultra clear and bright, I would be even happier. But next time, let's talk about using lager yeast for an IPA. If you're not used to using lager yeast ever, which you can ferment at higher temperatures, you could rock this at 65, upwards of 68 degrees Fahrenheit if you wanted. A big brewery around me, Firestone Walker, they have a beer called Hopnosis, if I remember correctly, and that is fermented with lager yeast. From the Reddit threads I've read, and other related homebrewing talk on the interwebs, a lot of people state the higher you run 3470, the less sulfur carries through into the keg. And I'll tell you, when I kegged this beer on day 11 or 12 or 13, whatever day it was I tried it, I thought I royally fucked this beer up, because it was like a sulfur bomb. It was like unpalatable. Not unpalatable, but like it was just sulfur. That's all I tasted was sulfur, sulfur, sulfur. And so I thought I ruined the batch. But within a week's time, so talking 20 days, 21 days, this was like just pungent, resiny Strata and Simcoe just coming to the front of the show. It was awesome. And so I think with 3470, at least for me, or this one time I've used it in a hoppy style, you have to kind of let it condition and let that sulfur quality dissipate before the beer really hits its prime. So keep that in mind if you decide to brew this recipe, or decide to brew any, hoppy style with lager yeast in general, particularly 3470. What would I do differently for this beer in my overall impressions? I think I would up the whirlpool amount, and I would keep everything the same. Maybe if you wanted, you can dial back the 90-minute addition from half an ounce to a quarter of an ounce, and then add more IBUs into the whirlpool. So instead of one of Simcoe and Strata, 1 ounce of Simcoe and Strata, I would do 2 ounces of each. And then in the dry hop, I would keep the 3 ounces of each. And if I had the option or ability, I would use the cryo version of both. Now, Simcoe has cryo version by YCH, and Strata now has their cryo version equivalent, which is CGX, and both of which are available. I actually have a pound of Strata CGX coming in the mail, and it should be here in a few days, along with a bunch of other goodies that we will see in the future. But if I were to revisit this recipe, add a little more in the whirlpool and add some cryo on top of the dry hop. That's the only thing I would change. Wouldn't change anything else. Wouldn't change fermentation schedule. Wouldn't change the in the grist. You can substitute different Pilsner malts if you don't have Admiral Pils available to you. It's only available through Admiral Maltings at the time. That's it. This is a West Coast IPA brewed with lager yeast and 100% Admiral Maltings, Admiral Pils. Make sure you check out all the Admiral Maltings videos I've done previously. Really cool. Learned a ton about malting. Learned a ton about everything that comes to do with grain and malt in general through those videos. Huge shout out to them for being willing to let me come film their facility and take up some of their time. I hope you guys enjoyed this grain and glass video of this West Coast IPA with Simcoe and Strata, some of my favorite hops. And if you do happen to brew this recipe, please let me know via Instagram. If you don't follow me, it's at HOPKILLER Brewery, or in the comments below. You can also shoot me an email. Email is always in the description. And hope you guys enjoyed. Catch you next time.